questions 14 and 15 were in John chapter 10, and just looking at verse 16, I'll go ahead and read it since it's just one verse. I have other sheep, this is Jesus speaking, I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. And the question first is, do the other sheep become Jesus' sheep before or after they are joined to this fold or sheep pen, depending on your translation? Well, the verse I think is pretty clear. Present tense, Jesus says, I have. So I currently have other sheep. So they are his sheep presently in this time, and that's when he's speaking here in this passage, that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen, so that's future tense, to my voice. And there shall, that's future tense, be one flock and one shepherd. So the time when they're joined to the fold, joined to the one flock, and then the time when there's one shepherd, this is after they are already his sheep. So from the beginning of the verse, he states that they are currently his sheep. So again, the people, I think, according to this verse, are his sheep even before they are joined to his fold or his sheep pen. They are his sheep before, that are not a part of his sheep pen. So before they're joined to the sheep pen, they're already his sheep. This takes us to question 15, which says, what do you think the fold or sheep pen represents? Because we have this picture here of this sheep pen. It's Jesus' sheep pen. He's the shepherd of this sheep pen. But then outside of this sheep pen, he has all of these other sheep that are his sheep. They belong to him. And he's saying that he will call them, they'll hear his voice, and then there will be one flock. So somehow they're going to get from out here, and then there will just be one flock and one shepherd. So what then does this sheep pen represent? This place where some of his sheep are housed, but also others of his sheep are outside of it. The concept that's I think very helpful to explain, that seems to be taught in both Old and New Testament, is the concept of the invisible and visible church. So bear with me if you've never heard this concept before. The visible church would be, and we're talking about visibility specifically from the perspective of humans. What can we visibly say is the church of God? Let's at least start with the Old Testament. That's easier. Who were the visible people of God? Who was the visible church of God? Easy. The descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the children of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, and their descendants were the people of God. They were the visible church of God. You could point to them and say, you are in the church, and you could point outside and say, you are not in the church. This is in the visible church. This is outside of the visible church. All right, that's pretty clear, I think. But the invisible church, now again, from the perspective of humans, it's a church that humans cannot quantify. You can't say these are all of the members. Nowhere on earth is there a list of the record of the members of all of sort of a record of all the members of this invisible church. This church is comprised of the true believers of God, God's true people. Remember, the Old Testament, we're talking about the Israelites. Very plainly, we know that all of the Israelites were not God's true people. Paul uses the phrase in Romans. He says, they are not all Israel which are of Israel. He says he's not a Jew who is one outwardly. Yes, you were born of Jewish parentage. Yes, you're circumcised on the 8th day, but circumcision is not that of the flesh. It's a matter of the heart. So even though they're born Jewish, they're members of the visible church. You would look at them and say, yes, you're in the visible church, and this person is not. They may not be members of the invisible church. And so back to our passage, the sheep pen, I believe, represents the visible church of God, those people that can be identified. And so those other sheep that Jesus has who are not of this sheep pen would be those members of the invisible church who are not members of the visible church. And Jesus states that his desire is that those members of the invisible church should become members of the visible church, that there be one church and one shepherd. Now, stated explicitly is the idea then that there be an ingathering, that there be a time where those members of the invisible who are not members of the visible would come into the visible. But also it's implied if there's going to be just one, that means that the members of the visible and the members of the invisible must be the same. So it implies that there should be members of the visible who are not members of the invisible. There's two options for them. They need to either become members of the invisible as well as members of the visible, or they would need to go out. So we have both an ingathering and an outgoing into this sheep pen, to this one sheep. Now, as I mentioned, the Old Testament is pretty clear. The New Testament, just after, after Jesus left, that's pretty clear as well. The visible church, of course, will be comprised of Jesus' followers, the church that Jesus established. You could identify them and say, you're a member of the way. Or at Antioch, the people could say, these are the Christians. They were called Christians. And so again, there we have that the visible church is clearly delineated. And also we see there in the New Testament that there were members of the visible church who were not members of the invisible church. Ananias and Sapphira are good examples of that. There are also members of the invisible church who were not members of the visible church. The Ethiopian eunuch is an example of that. So we have, again, the same concept of a visible church, a visible sheep pen, a visible sheepfold that has the members of it not always the same as the members of the invisible church. And so in the New Testament time, though we're 2,000 years from the beginning of it, there's still this desire of Jesus that has yet to be met, where the members of the invisible church and the members of the visible church are one. And as I stated earlier, that means that there must be a time where there will be a going out or a converting of those members of the visible that are not members of the invisible, and there must be a coming in of the members of the invisible into the visible. In this video, I won't go into trying to explain what I believe to be the visible church today, but I just want to express this concept, which I believe is very strongly taught here in this passage.